All right, everybody. I want to get going here. And before I begin, I would like to remind everybody in the audience to kind of do what I'm doing right here. I'm going to turn off my cell phone. See, there we go. And I'd also like to remind everybody to be sure to fill out your evaluation forms. It's a great way for us to find out how well we did as speakers and how to tune future boot camps. So, my name is Julian Love. I'm a lead technical artist at Blizzard Entertainment. And up until very recently, I was the lead technical artist for Diablo 3. I've since moved on to our totally secret and totally not a secret next-gen MMO that everybody knows about, including the ship date. And, but I still kind of spent a lot of time directing special effects for both projects, and I spent a lot of time with D3, so I've got a lot to talk about. In fact, there's so much to talk about with Diablo 3 special effects that there's just no way I could squeeze it all comprehensively into like 45 minutes or whatever. So I thought the way to kind of deal with that is to break it down into the 4 pillars that I think that we stood on really well throughout the project. And that way, it'll kind of give everybody who's a beginner in special effects something to take away, and somebody, even people who've been doing it for a long time, may find something in here. So let's talk about those pillars. First one being communicate gameplay. You can argue that all art in a game communicates gameplay, but I would say that VFX do it far more strongly and far more directly than just about anything else. And I think that implies a huge responsibility, and I'd like to talk about that responsibility in this section. Then we're going to move on to talk about another big topic, one that I would call relatability. And I think relatability is not something that we talk about as VFX artists often enough. We tend to talk about the tech and shaders and stuff like that. And relatability is pretty huge. So I'd like to cover that. Then we'll move into something that's a little more techy and talk about how we controlled readability in a game where there's just a crap ton of things going on in a game that's super fast-paced and hero skills like take up a third of the screen. And then we'll move into a real deep dive on some actual particle shaders and in a section that I'm calling Entertain the Lizard Brain, which is really about getting a certain baseline level of entertainment value into everything that you do. So let's dive right into communicate gameplay. Something that we spend a lot of time talking about is expectations. Expectations get set in a lot of different ways in a game. Sometimes it's set with a word. You call something super explodey bomb, you expect super explodey bombs. But they also get set by the graphics that you put on screen. If you make an explosion that's 50 yards wide, there's a certain expectation about what is happening there. And it's really important to talk about this stuff. One of the things you don't want to do is set an expectation that isn't going to be met by the design. So I wonder if anybody's had this experience. Maybe you're playing like a shooter game, and you've been using your machine gun, then you get a shotgun, then they finally give you the rocket launcher, and you're like, oh, awesome, rocket launcher. I'm going to blow the whole screen away with this. And you fire it, and sure enough, it makes like a 20-yard explosion. You're like, that's awesome. I'm going to go use it on some enemies. And you go and you use it on some enemies, and you fire at them, and you realize, after firing it like 3 or 4 times, that the actual area where the damage happens is like 10 yards. It's like 1/3 the size of the graphics. And then your brain does this weird thing where it's like, oh, wow, I got to relearn like how this really works. It's because the graphics are setting an expectation. It's not being met by the design. And it makes the game feel really bad. We do something super, super simple. There's no magic to this. We have a little mode that overlays our payloads on screen, and we just spend time making sure that the graphics we're putting on screen match those payloads. And it's one of the things that contributes to making the game feel tight. I think if you played Diablo 3 at all, one of the things you might agree with, if you didn't agree with anything else, is that combat feels really tight and really responsive and crisp. And this is one of the things that leads to that. Okay. So I'd like to tell you a story about a skill that didn't make it into the game. A skill called Ballista. It's going to be a skill we're going to put on the Demon Hunter. And when we started talking about Ballista, we just sort of kind of went off with the name Ballista. And the designers went in one corner, and we went in another. And the designers were thinking that Ballista would be something more akin to a skill called, what is this, Hungering Arrow. A skill that you would get between level 1 and 5. A low-level skill, something you would outgrow. You'd click many times to kill a monster with this skill. And as such, they were imagining that the graphics would be something like this. And then we saw the word Ballista, and we did something different. We imagined that it would be a mystical ballista that's almost bigger than the character themselves. And it would look like this. So those graphics kind of imply that the kind of damage that would be output is exactly what you see here. Monsters getting obliterated by this thing, right? And it wasn't until we got together with the designers that we realized there was going to be a problem with this. And that they're like, yeah, that's awesome, but level 5, everybody, you know, right? So anyway, I think this is just an example of us sometimes going to great pains to make sure that we're not setting an expectation with our graphics or our concepts that isn't going to be met by the game design, including not being able to put something really awesome like a giant laser beam in the game when it just didn't make sense. So we have drilled into the concrete of our campus our core values of our company. And the first one is gameplay first. And what that means is that when it comes down to it, you got to do what's right for the game and gameplay. And sometimes that means that the graphics have to be a little less than you might want them to be in order to do what's right for the game. So I want to give you an example of how we failed at this, rather than showing you how we did such a great job. This is a monster ability called Frozen. And all it does is it puts these little landmines on screen that after a certain period of time, they blow up. And when we shipped it, I think we did a really good job of telling the player where damage occurred, right? There's these radial explosions, and we even left an imprint on the ground telling you, this is where damage happened. The problem with this is that it's not really what the player needs to know. What they kind of need to know is where damage is going to happen. And somehow, through all of our rigorous process, we overlooked that and ended up shipping the wrong thing. Fortunately, we patched our game and added some graphics that I don't think made the skill look better. They don't. They make it look gamey. But they tell the player what the player needs to know, and that's what's important. So now I'd like to dive into relatability. Relatability is this topic that just doesn't get talked about enough, but we spend a lot of time talking about relatable things. One of my big pet peeves in games is when there's graphics on screen that are supposed to represent where damage is going to occur, but they just don't look like they're going to cause damage. And so one of the things that I've kind of developed over the years is this idea that damage is action. If you want to convince the player that damage is happening or is going to happen, you need action. If things are too serene, they're not going to get it. So here's an early look at Earthquake. This is like halfway through development. This is just our first attempt to slap something on screen. It's okay. It's saying some of the right things. It's got spiky shapes and stuff. But that first version just didn't have enough action, and it didn't really look like it caused a lot of damage. Most of the action is in these soft rings that come out of it, right? Now, if you looked at the reworked version, it's way more intense, and there's a hell of a lot more action in there. And that action is what translates in the player's mind to being damagey. Another thing that I like to do is a thing called utilizing primal fears. So I'm going to pick on WoW for a minute, rather than pick on anybody else's games. So here's a video capture from a raid, and all the players are supposed to be running away from that blue goop in the middle. And as you can see, they're being like really successful at it. They wiped. So now here's another view of that same boss fight, and I've overlaid a yellow circle so that you can see, like, this is the area they're supposed to stay away from. Now, honestly, I got to tell you, I think this is a total fail. That blue stuff melds into the background, so you can hardly tell what it is. It's slow motion, right? It just doesn't look like there's a lot of action, right? I mean, think about it. If you were to see that without any knowledge, what would you think? Like, I should run away from that because what, my boots are going to get wet, or I'm going to get blue stuff all over me? Like, but it doesn't look like I'm going to die from that. So when Wyatt came to me and he said, one of our designers, he came to me and he said, hey, I'd like to put that mechanic in our game and give it to monsters. And I'd like it to be shadowy and dark, black. And I was thinking, all right, black and a dark game. And I told him, my response was, I remember, it went something like this. It was, no, 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 never, ever, ever, ever. And he got kind of defensive, and he thought, like, hey, maybe I didn't like the mechanic. And I was like, no, no, it's not the mechanic. It's like, dude, if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that people know to stay the F away from this thing. Let's not call it Void Zone. Let's call it something else. And let's play on primal fears. And this is what we made, and it became known as Desecrater. If you look at this graphic, you can see what I'm getting at. Flashing yellow lights, outward motion, it's fire and it's lava, right? Like, two things that are super dangerous. Stay the hell away from me. That's what this says. It's very effective. Here's a thing that we hit on halfway through development that I have remembered ever since, and I thought it was super clarifying. And I didn't come up with this. It was one of our artists, a guy named Chris Haga, came up with this question. I think it's brilliant. And it's a great question to ask whenever you're trying to determine, is the graphics I'm about to put on screen, are those things going to be attractive or repellent to the player? How's the player going to respond? Because here's the deal. Like, yeah, playing on Primal Fears is great when you can do it. But you don't always have access to the color palette or the shape palette to do that with. So how can you convince people that they should stay away from something or walk towards something else? And a great thing that I think is overlooked is tempo. So the question, is this faster than a human heartbeat? Is it slower than a human heartbeat? Is a great way to clarify what you're putting on screen in terms of saying the right thing to your audience. So concepts with precedence. What's this all about? What I like to ask when people come to me, I don't ask them, I think of this in my head. People come to me all the time and they say, I got a great idea for the game. How about we make a bunch of blood, and you're going to walk in the blood and you're going to take damage? And the thing I start thinking about is, how is anybody going to get that? When have they ever seen blood that does damage? I mean, it's not like it's a bad concept or there's no way to do it. But in terms of footholds, for people to understand it, it's kind of got a lot going against it. Blood looks like stuff that happens after the damage, not during the damage or the thing that causes the damage. So one of the things I like to ask is, what is a common visual that people may have seen that I can use to illustrate this idea? So I thought during this section, the way we would do this is, I will put some things that we did on screen, and I'll ask the audience to tell me what you think the concept is, the visual concept that lies behind what we did. So looking at this monster and the way that he dies, what do we think the concept is? There's two words we're looking for here. Anybody? Firefly? Helicopter. Helicopter what? Blades or crash, right? It was helicopter crash. That's what we were thinking of. It's pretty obvious, right? But it gives everybody a hook into what we're doing. It's something they've seen before, and that means they can relate to it. So let's look at another example. This one's a little more abstract. This is a seismic slam for the Barbarian. So the concept here doesn't relate to seismology, at least the one that I ended up using, but I wonder if anybody can take a guess at what we think this one is. Is that a wave? What else? Tremors? What else? Dynamite, machine guns? Now we're getting close. Landmines, that's even better. Tell you what, I looked at carpet bombing footage from Vietnam. Doesn't really have anything to do with seismology, as suggested by the name, but that visual is something that a lot of people have seen, and it just makes it sit that much easier on your brain. Let's look at another one. What do we think this one is? The The way the guy dies. The way the siege breaker eats the dude. What do we think that might be? Milky Way. Milky Way bar. Right? See when he dies? The blood? It's like, ew, it's like eating a Milky Way bar. Apparently, guards taste really delicious. Here's the last one. This one is more, honestly, it's a little bit more of a nod to a reference than it is a visual idea. What do you think? Here's a hint. You got to pay attention to the license plate. Jaws. There it is. It's that scene from Jaws where, where Hooper's pulling the guts out of the tiger shark, and then that license plate comes right at the camera, and then I think Brody says something like, he ate a car. Gluttony ate a car. That's what we're saying here. Gotta watch it one more time. There's a license plate in Diablo, yes. Okay, so another thing that we can do, basically what we've been talking about so far are things that you can do to make things relatable. We should also talk about things that you shouldn't do in order to make things relatable. And here's one of my peeves. What's that? Maybe. Yeah. It's just stuff. It's just a bunch of arbitrary shapes. It doesn't mean anything. Like, it's well crafted, maybe, right? It looks nice, it's pleasing, it's got some nice color unity and all that. But what the hell is it? I don't know what that is. It's just stuff. And I see this a lot in fantasy games. If you're making games that are like, modern shooters, you really don't have this problem to worry about because the game is already so grounded that you don't have the license to go put something like this in the game. You're not dealing with really heady or abstract concepts. So try not to do that. And we tried, but we didn't always get it right. There's a couple cases, with 750 skills to build in the game. We got it wrong a few times. This is a skill called Crippling Wave on the Monk, which, quite honestly, had we done that skill on the Witch Doctor, I think it would have been a slam dunk. We would have done Disease, and the name really would have sunk in really well, I think. But without that, we just had to try to ground it any way we could by throwing runes on the screen. It just came to us as a jumble of mechanics and never a visual concept. And it really made it very difficult for us to find our way out. I think Level Up is another example where it's just a totally abstract concept. I mean, Tolkien has a hard time making you understand what Level Up is. It takes several pages, and there's a lot of murky text, to try to explain how Gandalf goes from the gray to the white. It's just very abstract. So we ended up doing some abstract things. Here's another big tip, though. So I teach particle class at Blizzard Academy, which is something that Rachel's going to talk about when I'm done. And one of the things that I have to try to drill into every student that I teach is the way you start has a lot to do with what you will get. So the mistake I see that's often made is people want to start with a texture or a shader, or they dive right into the particle system. And they're 7 steps into the process, and they've skipped the most important thing. And the most important thing is coming up with a clear description of exactly what's going to happen. This player casts a skill. How? Does it come from the air? Does it come from the ground? Does it come from them? How does it get on screen? What's the story behind how this action manifests itself? If you get that stuff down, and you work against that clear description of action, you will find that the things that you put on screen are much more driven by a concept rather than technology. And as a result, you will less often put an arbitrary mishmash of geometric shapes on screen to try to explain something, because you'll have that description that's grounding your process. So if you look at these examples, you can see we really had a clear description. This is how it happens. Watch how this guy dies. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk a little bit about techie stuff, because this is like a tech art group. You probably are dying for that now. Additive shading. We use it, and we have to be careful with it, because if you put enough things on screen that are additively shaded, you just get a bunch of white, right? And when the screen turns white, people can't see what the hell's going on. So we use a technique we didn't invent this. It's been around forever. It's super cheap. I think everybody probably knows about it. We call it blend add. And I actually don't know what it's called outside the confines of Blizzard, but I figured I'd just walk you through blend add shading in case you've never encountered this concept before. But it's really important for controlling additive buildup. So our example there on the left, we have a 24-bit texture where there's a bunch of content painted on black. There's no alpha channel. That result is added into the buffer. And since the buffer in this case is this yellow background, you get this totally blown out result. You're losing shape, you're losing saturation. If you get a lot of that on screen, your game's just going to turn white. And then usually, once people have exhausted that as an option, they go to blending. Well, let's blend it, right? And with blending, you've got an RGB channel that's a little different, that it doesn't include any black in it. And the alpha channel is there to describe where the texture will show up on the screen. This is great for maintaining saturation and shape, but it doesn't really look like it's glowing, which is kind of a big deal for Lightning. It's not that you couldn't do a better job than I've done here. It's just that it's really hard against multiple backgrounds to make this convincing. If we look at what blend add does, our blend add shaders, we provide the same RGB content that we would have provided in an additive scenario, but now we're using our alpha channel in a different way. And I've changed the alpha channel here to account for that. Here, the alpha channel controls where the texture will be added versus where it will be blended. And if you look at it, white is blend and black is add. And then all the grays in between just lurk between those two possibilities. And so that's what accounts for our ability to have a lot more saturation control, making sure those shapes are really crisp in the center, but yet making it look like it's still adding up or still glowing a little bit. Now, if we look at this in the dungeon, you can't really tell the difference too much, because the dungeon's dark. But as soon as we shift to an outdoor scene, such as the desert, you can really see how much different this is. If you imagine 4 wizards electrocuting the crap out of a bunch of monsters in one game in the desert, it literally is completely unreadable. You cannot tell what's going on. So blend add was a really big trick for us in terms of getting all that stuff. The thing about blend add is it's super cheap. It doesn't cost extra draws. It just costs a few extra stages, and it doesn't cost extra texture memory. So there really is no excuse anymore for having additive buildup in a game. Okay, let's dive really deep now into probably the most techie section I've got. I have some math in this one. Yeah, get ready. So lasting impressions. I would like to make sure that the stuff we're putting in our games have lasting impressions on people. I love it when people can stare at things for a long time and space out on them, right? Like, has anybody here gone camping recently? Or in the last? Yeah, and did you bring your iPhone with you? Straight up camping, right? And you had a campfire. Yeah? No. Oh, that doesn't count. Anybody go camping with a campfire? Yeah. And, okay, here's what I think you might have discovered that a lot of people have forgotten, which is how damn entertaining a campfire can be when you don't have something else to entertain you. Campfires are like endlessly entertaining, especially, if you've imbibed a little bit, right? So what I'm getting at here is I think that there's no reason why we shouldn't be putting the same level of entertainment value into our special effects that exist in a campfire. And that's a goal that we have for the special effects of Diablo. And there's a technique that we use to try to get that little nuance of sort of endlessly evolving, never repeating kind of entertainment value into the stuff that we did. And we didn't use flipbooks for this, because flipbooks, although I've seen them done very well, probably by some of the people who are in this room, I think once you stare at any flipbook for just a few minutes, the illusion is broken, because eventually you'll see some repeats or something about it. And so this technique kind of takes that away. So it's basically texture multiplication shaders. And we use the holy crap out of these things. We use them on almost everything that we do. The formula, here's the math I spoke of, right? The formula is old as the hills. There's nothing new or crazy about this. We didn't invent it. It's texture 1 times texture 2 times 2. And I know this gets used in other games. I don't think we're the first to do it by any stretch. But I'll tell you this, just from looking at the results, I think we spent a lot more time digging into what could you really do with this. We have a game that has to run on really, really low-end hardware, so we have to make the best out of very little things. And it turns out you can go a long way with this in terms of creating dynamic alpha shapes. So let's look at, I want to walk you through how does this stuff work in case you've never encountered it before. It is kind of amazing for being so simple. Here is texture 1 alpha times texture 2 alpha times 2. Texture 1 has no RGB content. The alpha channel is filled with Photoshop tiled clouds. Texture 2 is the same texture. It's scrolling at a slightly different rate as texture 1. And on the right, we have a single particle that's rendered with this shader. And you can see, sometimes it looks like two textures sliding over each other. Sometimes it almost starts to look like it's like time-lapse of clouds, right? It kind of waffles back and forth. Turns out you can make that a whole lot better, that illusion, by just doing one change, which is to scale the UVs of the second texture by 0.5, which makes the second texture twice as big. And now there's no twinning between the textures. And the result is it's looking more like time-lapse of clouds. Think about it, that's one particle, that's a lot of complexity for very, very low cost. All we're doing is multiplying, so it's definitely not hard. Let's make this even more complicated. Let's throw in a third texture on our particle. So our second texture is, again, half the frequency of the first, so it's an octave down. Our third texture, same texture, but an octave up, twice the frequency. And all three are scrolling at different speeds. And now what you see is a much more dramatic complexity emerge in terms of the cloud formations. And we're getting some nice blown out areas, which is great for alpha channels because the white is what carries the content, whatever our color content was going to be. That's one particle. But you might say, hey, it kind of sucks, I can see the edges, where are you really going to go with that? Well, if we just add a fourth texture, which is really only the second texture since the first three are the same one, and we just let it be a mask. So we take the first three textures that we multiply together, we multiply that result into one fourth texture to control where the results are going to be. And now you've got something that you can really work with. What would that look like if we had 7 particles and we randomized the offset of their UVs for every texture and randomized their scroll speeds? So here's 7 particles worth of complexity. So in terms of costs, this is nothing. This is so cheap. And yet, look how complicated it is, right? Wow, we surely could be doing a heck of a lot with that, I think. So let's look at ways in which we use this. So back to just 2 textures. Here's wood wraith poison. Same texture used in both channels. We do randomly offset and scroll the second texture, and we do auto-rotate or randomly rotate the particles. 17 particles, super complicated looking from a motion standpoint. Like I think if maybe, you were a little bit stoned, you probably could stare at that for a little while. Here's another example, the Siege Breaker Fire. We're using 2 different textures here. Alphas are being multiplied together, just using the RGB as it is. Looks super complicated, especially for just 34 particles. We did the same thing with all the blowing sand and snow in the game. 23 particles for that kind of complexity. It's kind of outrageous. And then here's a frost trail. Here, the second texture is handling all of the alpha. We're not scrolling the first texture. Its job is just to show where the shape is going to be. All right, so if it's good for alpha doing this kind of thing, then shouldn't it also be really good for color? And the answer is, yeah. It's actually pretty awesome for color. So here's RGB and alpha both being derived by the same formula. So texture1.rgb times texture2.rgb times 2, same thing for alpha. And you get all this crazy complexity in both the color and the alpha. that results from it. And you can get this dynamic creation of color through two textures coming together. So let's take a deeper dive in how that works. Looking at Arcane Orb, this is actually 2 draws to do this effect. And it looks like insanely complicated, especially for 12 particles. But part of the answer is if you look at what happens on an individual particle, you can see the one on the left has a little something extra. It's not huge. We're talking about a 10, 20% difference, honestly. But it has more color motion and more dynamicism than the one on the right. It is subtle, but it is, like I said, it's that difference of what makes a campfire entertaining versus, say, just a flip book. Let's look at another example. It's a little more overt. This is Lacuni Fire. And you'll notice that it's got a lot of color motion in it. For just 2 textures, it looks really complicated. If you look at the individual particles, it's easy to see. There's a lot more motion in the one on the left, a lot more secondary motion. There's also a giant seam in the texture. We'll overlook that. But if you look at these two, the one on the left just has a little something extra. And it's that something extra that makes it the kind of thing that you can just zone out on. All right. I did show you more textures than just 2 earlier. And so I'd like to show you what we did when we had a lot more textures to use. And probably the best case used for this is pseudo-volume work. Things that look like they're volumetric but aren't. Because nothing is really that volumetric in Diablo 3. So here's the smoke that you see often in Act 2 and Act 3. And it looks really thick. It isn't. It's just particles. And it's using the same trick that's been used for years in that we just painted light into the RGB channel. But usually what happens when you do that is the result is you end up having to make a lot of flip books, right, in order to compensate for the fact that as soon as you paint light into a smoke result or a smoke texture, it starts to look very remarkable. It's easy to see the repeats and the patterns. And people try to hide that by just making more variations. But eventually it breaks down. Unless you throw like just tons and tons of variations at it, it just doesn't work out. So what we're doing here is we're not rotating the particles to try to create that variation, and we're not using flipbooks. Instead, we're using 2 channels or 2 textures worth of alpha content to create a ridiculous amount of dynamic shape change over the course of a particle's life. And it creates a nice breakup. If you look at that, like, find the pattern in it. You really can't see it. But it looks lit, and it looks thick. And it's super cheap. It's 60 particles for that kind of result. With a bunch of multiplication math, it's nothing. We also use this same technique for fire. So it's a Diablo game. There's going to be fire everywhere. There's some scenes where we literally had to fill like a third of the screen with fire. How are we going to do that and not blow overdraw budget? And the answer is this same technique. Now, I think if you saw last year's talk about Uncharted 3, they have some really advanced stuff that they're doing, like flow maps and stuff like that. We just couldn't afford that kind of technique, so we had to come up with something simpler. And multiplication really came to the rescue here. The RGB and alpha channels are basically just all being multiplied together to create the result. And I think if you look at it if you look at it on edge, it doesn't blow out as much as if that were like 100 particles or 80 particles like you'd normally see. And there's a good example of the particle count and also the overdraw. The other thing I would point out about that overdraw view is look how little the particles are actually doing. They're kind of just serving as like generally lazy billboards. All of the complexity is happening inside the particle at the shading level. And of course, like I said, that math is just super, super dumb. Okay, so let's recap a little bit. 4 pillars that we really stood on here. Communicate gameplay, right? It's more important to tell the player what they need to know than to make stuff look good. Visual effects affect how tight your combat feels, right? It's a big, big part of how the game feels. Get it wrong, game feels bad. Make it relatable. You can put whatever you want on screen, but the more people can relate to it, the more common the visual that you're borrowing from, the quicker it is for people to read it and understand it, and the more they relate to it. It promotes immersion. It helps people just sink into the game. Don't ruin the experience. These days, there really is no excuse for not having what we call BlendAdd as a shader for particle systems or effects. Any programmer worth his salt can give you this, and it doesn't cost extra draws. It's super cheap. Just a few extra stages and you're in. And then finally, entertain the lizard brain, which is, I think, if you look at how simple the solutions that we have to try to accomplish that goal, how simple they really are, I would say, again, there really isn't any reason why we can't be putting things in the game that have at least the baseline level of entertainment value that a simple campfire is capable of, or at least approaching that level. All right, so I think we're ready for some Q&A. And clapping, yes. I've been taught to count to 16 from counting. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about your sort of billboard generation? Did you use like just artist work in Photoshop, or did you mostly use like, you could render out extremely complex scenes with stuff like Houdini and millions of particles just to generate the billboards?
It's all Photoshop. We don't do anything with Houdini, mostly because there's very few flipbooks. Most of our flipbooks that we use are flipbook picking, so we're not playing the flipbook like a movie. There are some cases that we use flipbooks like those moths, clouds, and things like that. Mostly we use flipbooks for crowd sims and things like that. But apart from that, almost no flipbook work. So there's really no reason for us to go out to an external program and sim. I think the other reason why we don't do that is because we don't want things that look realistic. I think there are realistic elements to some of the things that we did, like putting light in our smoke and things like that. But that's kind of where it stops. We really were shooting for a stylized looking game. And I think going out to simulators, it's not like you couldn't do stylization. It just doesn't really support where we were going. So by and large, a handful of filters in Photoshop, but a whole lot of painting. I tend to paint about 80% of what I would do. And I think that's about the ratio that other people do as well at Blizzard.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
So you have a lot of skills and stuff in Diablo, and you've got all these particles going on and all that stuff. How, from like a design standpoint, do you deal with the fact that monsters and stuff can have random, like they can just have 5 of these abilities and stuff, and all this is going to be on the screen at the same time? Like, how do you really deal with that?
So the question is, how do we deal with readability of having design be so random? Playtesting is one. You kind of have to look at your game a lot. And I think there's also a certain amount of accounting in our heads as effects artists. We kind of have to, like, we're the ones making all of this stuff, and we kind of have to keep sort of a list or accounting of what we've done. So people would come to me sometimes and they would say, hey, I want to make this poison, or I want to make this blue fire. And my response would be to immediately start thinking about the design rather than the graphic elements. And the thing that I'm thinking about is, hey, if we make that blue fire, is the player going to understand it? Versus if we made it look like regular fire, and that's what they've been encountering. Will they know what to do about it? Or will they be freaked out about it? Like, blue fire, what the hell does that do? Like, do I have the right resist for blue fire? I don't know. What's blue fire called? Right? So I think there's a little bit of just, 1, play the game a lot. 2, BlendAdd shaders to just keep everything readable. But then the third one is, at some point, you just have to have the whole thing in your head. And you have to be thinking about, okay, how is this thing going to read against something else? In fact, the real long answer to your question is, that's how Arcane Sentry was born, in that it started out looking like Hydra. And it just was very hard to pick it out amongst all the other stuff. And so we kind of just did a big deep dive at the last minute and said, why don't we just change the whole way the skill is designed in order to get a different kind of shape and a different kind of motivation on screen? And then I think we ended up making one of the most hated things from a gameplay standpoint in the game. People were really annoyed by it, which is awesome.
Thank you.
That was the goal.
Hi.
Yeah.
Do you think these shader techniques are efficient enough to work in a mobile pipeline?
Yeah. We're talking about multiplication between sometimes the same texture, right? And scaling UVs. That's super cheap. Like, you can do that on a phone. for sure. The big costs in this methodology are actually not in texture memory, and they're not in shader math. They're all in tracking all of those different textures over time on a per particle basis. So it's mostly CPU cost in tracking, like, basically the UV scrolling for every single particle. But there is a benefit to that in that in fact, this is how I sold the idea of doing this to our programmers. We used to have only two textures in our particles for like the first 4 years of development. And I went to them and I said, if you give me 2 more textures for our particles, and before I even got the words out, he was like, no, you can't have that. It's going to be really expensive. I said, yeah, but I will cut our particle counts in half, especially the big overdraw ones. And he went, oh, all right, well, maybe, right? We'll talk about it. And then we ended up putting it in the game. And I think the fire is a really good example. Like, come on, 25 particles to do a giant firewall? That was a huge win, honestly, from a performance standpoint.
Thank you.
What's the design process like between your combat designers and your VFX artists? What's the team makeup and the duration like, and how much back and forth?
We sit right next to those guys for good reason. It's because we like to step on each other's toes all the time. There's a lot of skills in the game that literally were designed by us, at least initially. And there's the majority of skills in the game were designed by them. And some of the visual ideas are theirs that we liked and ran with. And then, of course, there's a huge balance of ones that are ours. It's kind of messy. At times, it really didn't seem like we were 2 different teams. And I think that's the way, that's what you want in any given situation. Having that kind of freedom to go to them and say, hey, I know that you're doing this with this skill, but I'd really like the witch doctor to turn himself into a chicken and then blow himself up, right? They're like, well, you're really stepping on my design toes, buddy. And it's like, yeah, but you're going to turn yourself into a chicken and blow up. Are you seriously telling me no? And the answer, of course, goes, yeah, all right, we're going to do that. Yeah, we have to do that. And so it's just messy, and there's a lot of collaboration. And it honestly just makes the process a lot of fun.
With blend-add sorting, I've kind of been familiar with that using the term pre-mold alpha. Did you have a lot of issues with going to a sort-dependent blend-out versus add that's sort-independent, and having to worry about triangle sorting and the perf issues associated with that? And then as a follow-up, did you perform your UV transforms on the particles in the vertex shader, or did you just kind of deal with them being in the pixel shader? The particle gets full screen, you're doing a UV offset millions of times versus just 4 for the individual particle?
You might have to repeat the second question after I get the first one. The first one was, were the sorting issues with blend-add, and how did we cope with it? Well, the blend-add particles don't sort any different than any other particles in the game, and all of our transparency stuff is actually sorted in one layer. So we do a transparency layer that we render, and then anything that is transparent gets stuffed into that. Then there is a per particle system or per geometry offset, so that we can force things to the front or back in order to get that to work. With blend-add, it's not a big problem in that there isn't a second pass. It's all being done in one pass, so it's really no different than if we were adding or blending. But your second question was?
Performing the UV offsets on the particles in the vertex shader or in the pixel shader?
Oh, wow, you're really asking the wrong guy.
Okay. Because that has
I have no idea.
Performance consideration, at least in our engine in the beginning, was you're performing 4 vertex offsets to get the UV to scroll.
Yeah.
Versus millions if the particle becomes full screen. And I think that's become kind of a non-issue with DirectX 11, but it still exists with DX9.
I don't know, it didn't seem to be, I don't know
I
what
was wondering
they
if
did.
the programmers are screaming at you about it, because I've had, programmers certainly we've had discussions about it.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay.
I'm like, give me tech, I paint. I can design a shader, but I can't code one. I also can't draw my own name, so I'm kind of somewhere in the middle.
Sure. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you tend to try and pack all of your alphas and textures and stuff into a single texture file, or does it matter so much if they're broken up into different files?
No, separate files for sure. It kind of screws with the whole scrolling thing if they're all packed together. Also, in a game like this where we were using a lot of content, we have this texture type. We called it bony clouds, because we took some Photoshop clouds and then we tweaked it a little bit so it's kind of like, looks like a microscopic view of bone. It's like kind of all broken up. I think that texture gets used like 1,000 times throughout the game. If you could look into the data while the game was running, like a matrix view, there'd be bony clouds everywhere, and you'd be like, what the hell? I think that kind of is served a little bit better by not packing the textures together, which would force us to have to constantly be reloading large textures, versus keeping them small. In fact, for this game, it's like mostly 256s and 128s. Keeping those small actually promotes not having to load a lot of textures and swap them out that much, and actually serves the performance of the game a lot better.
Cool.
Especially when you don't know what the hell's going to happen next.
I have a question. If memory-wise and performance-wise is not a problem, what do you prefer, animation texture or the blending we use the?
You mean like flipbooks versus this?
Yeah.
I would use flipbooks for things. In fact, I kind of have these rules of thumb. Flipbooks for things that are flickery. Flipbooks when I just want a few extra impressions of shapes. And we use flipbooks a ton for simulating crowds. Like if you go into Act 3, as that act opens up, there's a giant battle scene where there's literally thousands and thousands of demons coming at you. If you look over the walls, which most people don't, because they're usually killing things and picking up loot. But if you just spend some time looking at that, we did a lot of crowd sim work out there. Those things are obviously all flipbooks, because that's kind of the only way to do that stuff. For everything else, I try to avoid flipbooks like the plague, because one, they are texture memory hogs, and we need to kind of control that. And two, they always play back at a constant rate. So no matter what the frame rate is of the game, you get one rate, and it at some point becomes really obviated. I think it kind of pulls the curtain back a little bit, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then, like I said earlier, at some point they repeat and you see it. You can hide that stuff well. There's some people out there they're so good at it. Better than I'll probably ever be. But I think for us to just avoid it also tended to land us in a different spot, look-wise, relative to how a lot of other games do it. And I think there's value in that, and that it is a part of our style that we avoid flipbooking.
Okay, thank you.
Any more? One more question, if anybody has one. All right, that was cool.